Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is pretty simple. We take a stack of what can be dense, sometimes confusing source material, and we really break it down.
We pull out the vital, compelling nuggets of knowledge that you actually need.
Exactly. We're here to give you that shortcut to being, genuinely well-informed. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the life and really the world-changing work of Albert Bruce Sabin.
He's the medical researcher whose vision ultimately defeated one of the most terrifying diseases of the 20th century, poliomyelitis.
And it is an extraordinary historical file we're opening up. It's not just about a huge scientific achievement.
No, not at all. It's also about a defining moral stance that, well, it truly sets Sabin apart in the annals of medical history.
Our sources today, they cover his entire career, from his early life, his scientific foundations,
all the way through the fierce competition of the vaccine race, and right up to his final, very personal reflections on human suffering.
Okay, so let's unpack this and really set the scene. We have to start by acknowledging the shadow that polio cast over the mid-20th century. For you, the listener, if you didn't live through that era, it's so hard to grasp the level of pervasive fear.
It truly is. Polio was an absolute menace, particularly in the U.S. during the summer months. It felt random.
It could strike any child, any family, and the outcome could be paralysis or even death.
And this intense, immediate threat, it fueled this fierce global scientific race.
We're involving some huge figures, people like Jonas Salk, of course, Hillary Kaprowski, H.R. Koch.
And the man at the center of our discussion today, Albert Sabin.
The sources really confirm that urgency. I mean, it drove everything. Polio epidemics weren't just abstract numbers on a page.
No, they were events that shut down entire communities. They closed swimming pools, playgrounds.
The fear was tangible.
And hospitals were overflowing with children in iron lungs. The scientific community knew they were fighting a race against time, and that desperation it allowed for, and you could argue it necessitated, some really bold, even risky research approaches.
But the personal story of Sabin, the man who developed the vaccine that ultimately paved the way for global eradication, it starts so far from those established American medical institutions.
It does, and this is where it gets really fascinating.
The sources show he wasn't born Albert Sabin at all. He was born Abram Saperstejn.
That's right. In 1906, in Białystok, which was then part of the Russian Empire, it's in modern-day Poland.
He emigrated with his Polish-Jewish family in 1921, arriving in New York.
And the sources note he became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1930. That's when he officially changed his name to Albert Bruce Sabin.
This transformation just feels so symbolic of the man we're discussing. He's adaptable, he's driven, he's constantly moving toward a new identity, a greater purpose.
And that ultimate purpose, it wasn't driven by wealth, it was driven by accessibility.
And we have to introduce the ethical heart of his legacy right here at the top. He refused to patent the oral polio vaccine, the OPV.
Precisely. The sources are absolutely unequivocal about this. It was a profound ethical decision.
He deliberately waived all commercial exploitation rights.
He did. It was a direct choice, and he made it so that the vaccine's price would be low. You're talking pennies per dose.
All to guarantee its universal and widespread application across the globe.
Especially in developing nations, where poor sanitation made the disease so much more prevalent.
Imagine the pressure. You develop arguably the most effective tool to eradicate one of the world's most terrifying diseases.
A discovery that would normally be a guaranteed path to, well, unimaginable personal wealth.
And you just say, no, this belongs to the people.
Right.
What did the sources say about the pressure he must have faced to capitalize on this?
Well, the sources confirm he just continued to live on his professor's salary at the University of Cincinnati. His justification was very simple, and it was rooted in public health.
Any profit motive would just slow it all down.
It would slow down global distribution, it would drive up the price, and that would limit its reach. He saw the vaccine as a gift to humanity, not a product.
That wasn't just unusual, it was.
It fundamentally changed the landscape of vaccine philanthropy. It set an ethical benchmark that, frankly, is rarely matched even today.
That moral clarity is what defines him. So for you, the learner, we're going to dive deep into the technical details of Sabin's critical scientific breakthrough.
We'll explore that unique insight he had into the poliovirus's life cycle that completely changed vaccine strategy forever.
We'll also get into the intense professional rivalries of the era, particularly with Salk.
And we'll look at the shocking international politics, including his crucial collaboration with the Soviet Union right at the height of the Cold War.
which amazingly led to the mass use of his vaccine long before it was even available here in the U.S.
As we get into the early career of Albert Sabin, it's just fascinating how often these monumental careers begin with an unexpected pivot.
Right. We know he graduated high school in Paterson, New Jersey after emigrating. When he enrolled at New York University, his first major was dentistry.
Dentistry. It seems completely removed from the microscopic world of virology, doesn't it?
Totally. He had a small scholarship for it, but the sources say this only lasted a few weeks before he made a really sharp turn. What happened? What caused that abrupt shift?
It seems it was just an immediate, overwhelming fascination with microbiology and infectious disease, and it was spurred on by a mentor.
So he just caught the bug, so to speak.
He really did. He quickly switched majors, focusing intensely on virology and pathology. He got his Bachelor of Science in 1928 and then his MD in 1931 from NYU.
That rapid change, it highlights not just adaptability, but this intense, almost singular focus on scientific investigation.
Right. He wasn't interested in the predictable world of, say, clinical practice. He was chasing the unknown mechanisms of disease.
And his formative training after that was incredibly broad, which probably made him such a formidable researcher down the line.
It really was. From 1931 to 1933, he trained at Bellevue Hospital in New York City.
And he studied everything. Internal medicine, pathology, surgery. This wasn't just a brief rotation. This was a deep immersion.
Absolutely. Understanding disease manifestation across the entire human body. And that broad clinical perspective, it served him so well when he moved into dedicated research.
In 1934, his ambition took him to the Lister Institute for Preventive Medicine in England.
A highly prestigious institution. Then he returned to the U.S. to the iconic Rockefeller Institute, and that's where his intense interest in infectious diseases really solidified.
This period must have been crucial for a young scientist. He's being exposed to the absolute cutting edge of bacteriology and virology.
Disciplines that were still, relatively new and undefined at the time.
And this grounding in diverse research environments made him ideal for the next big global challenge, World War II.
Yes, he served as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, but his contribution wasn't in a field hospital. It was in high-pressure vaccine development.
Exactly. The sources note he played a key role in developing a vaccine against Japanese encephalitis during the war.
And this is so crucial for understanding his skill set. Developing a wartime vaccine requires speed, efficiency, and the ability to scale up production and deployment almost immediately.
So he was getting this practical knowledge of mass immunization logistics, but under extreme duress.
Skills he would absolutely need decades later for the global polio campaign.
And then after the war, he settles into this period of deep, sustained research in Cincinnati, Ohio.
He joined Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and by 1946, he's the head of pediatric research at the University of Cincinnati. This institutional stability was the platform for his polio breakthrough.
It wasn't just about his own work either, was it?
No, that stability allowed him to dedicate real time to mentorship. The sources specifically highlight his relationship with a researcher named Robert M. Chanek,
Who Sabin called his star scientific son.
It reinforces this image of Sabin as a leader, building an infrastructure of research talent dedicated to tackling these really complex pediatric diseases.
Okay, now we arrive at the critical scientific aha moment. The poliovirus was tricky.
Very tricky. And researchers knew by 1951 that it wasn't just one threat, it was 3 distinct types, or serotypes.
Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. You couldn't just develop a vaccine against Type 1 and assume it would work against the other.
No, you needed a triple threat, a trivalent vaccine.
This complexity, it required a really deep understanding of how the virus interacted with the host.
And Sabin's most fundamental insight came from a painstaking, very direct method of investigation, performing autopsies.
He looked at the bodies of polio victims, and his work demonstrated something completely counterintuitive to the paralysis-focused view of the time.
Right. He showed that the poliovirus first multiplied and attacked the intestines, the gut, before it moved systemically into the bloodstream and eventually to the central nervous system.
Where all the irreversible damage occurred.
Exactly.
This completely reframed the challenge, didn't it? If the conventional approach, the one Salk was pursuing, was focused on protecting the central nervous system.
Sabin was basically saying, wait, we're focusing on the symptom, we're looking at the end of the story. We need to stop the replication at the entry point.
That is the key physiological differentiator. His finding wasn't just academic, it had massive practical implications.
It confirmed that polio was primarily an enteric disease.
Meaning it spread through the fecal-oral route.
and that the gut was the primary site of viral multiplication and shedding.
And this insight had a second crucial scientific implication, though the ultimate breakthrough here belongs to others.
That's a very important point. Sabin's work suggested that since the virus multiplied so successfully in the non-nerve tissue of the intestines, it might be possible to culture it in non-nerve tissue in the lab.
Which was the holy grail for mass production.
It was. Growing the virus in nerve tissue, like from monkeys, was prohibitively expensive, it was dangerous, and it produced highly impure batches.
But culturing it in non-nerve tissue, like monkey kidney cells,
Yeah.
that would be a game changer.
And we have to pause here to give credit where it's due. The sources are very clear that while Sabin's work pointed the way, the successful breakthrough in culturing the poliovirus in lab cultures of non-nerve tissue was made by John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins in 1949.
For which they won the Nobel Prize in 1954.
Right.
So their Nobel-winning technique made large-scale vaccine production economically feasible.
But Sabin's physiological insight knowing the infection started in the gut. That was the intellectual foundation for choosing the type of vaccine that would be most effective for eradication.
His realization that the infection started and replicated profusely in the digestive tract was the fundamental difference.
And it convinced him that any successful long-term solution needed a vaccine that could induce a localized mucosal immune response in the gut to block transmission.
Which sets the stage for the head-to-head confrontation with Jonas Salk's methodology.
And that leads us perfectly into one of the most famous scientific duels in modern history.
The mid-1950s was really defined by this rivalry, Salk versus Sabin. There are two vaccines, Salk's inactivated poliovirus vaccine, or IPV, and Sabin's oral poliovirus vaccine, OPV.
They represent two fundamentally different philosophies on how to fight a viral disease.
Let's start with the one that reached the market first, the Salk approach.
So Salk developed the IPV, which was licensed in 1955. It's what we call a killed vaccine.
Meaning the poliovirus was chemically inactivated, usually with formalin, before it was administered.
Right, and it was given via injection. When injected, this dead virus triggers the immune system to produce antibodies.
And when it was released, it was seen as an undeniable miracle. It dramatically reduced the rates of paralytic polio in the U.S.
Wow.
And was met with justifiable public euphoria.
Absolutely.
But based on Sabin's earlier research, what was the biological Achilles heel of this dead vaccine?
The problem was precisely where Sabin had focused his own research: the gut. While the IPV injection created a strong systemic immunity, meaning you had IgG antibodies circulating in the bloodstream, it did not effectively stimulate local immunity in the intestinal lining.
So a person who got the Salk vaccine was highly protected against the virus reaching their central nervous system, protected against paralysis.
Yes.
Highly protected.
But they were still carriers, essentially.
Exactly. The virus could still enter their gut, it could replicate for a period, and then be shed through feces, especially in areas with poor sanitation.
So they were protected from the disease themselves, but they could still unwittingly transmit the wild virus to unimmunized people.
Which makes the Salk vaccine fantastic for individual protection, but really insufficient for community-wide eradication.
And that brings us to the Sabin approach, the live attenuated OPV. This used carefully engineered mutant strains of the poliovirus.
One for each of the three serotypes, and the term here is crucial, attenuated, meaning weakened.
They were designed to stimulate a robust immune response, but without possessing the neurovirulence, the ability to cause paralysis. And the mechanism of attenuation is fascinating. It's also key to understanding the technical risk involved. Sabin achieved this by what's called serial passage, repeatedly growing the virus in lab cultures of non-human cells, often monkey kidney cells, for many, many generations. Through this repeated growth in a foreign, non-human environment, the virus naturally loses its ability to successfully replicate and infect human nerve tissue.
So you're basically training the virus to forget how to be dangerous to humans. It's a sophisticated technique, but it also carries this inherent risk, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely does.
Introducing a live virus, no matter how weakened, into population is a high-stakes gamble compared to Salk's killed virus.
It is, and that was the core of the opposition he faced. But the trade-off was worth the risk because of the mechanism of action.
The OPV, taken orally, mimicked a natural infection.
Exactly. It replicated successfully in the gut lining for a short period, and that stimulated both the systemic IgG response and, critically, the localized secretory IgA response in the intestines.
So if Salk's IPV was like a shield protecting the nervous system,
Sabin's OPV was an impenetrable roadblock at the gate.
by stimulating that IgA response in the intestinal lining, the virus couldn't even gain a foothold to replicate and be shed.
Correct. By blocking the intestinal replication, the Sabin vaccine broke the chain of transmission in the community entirely.
This key epidemiological difference meant that mass vaccination with OPV was the necessary method to achieve herd immunity and, ultimately, global eradication.
Salk prevented illness. Sabin stopped the spread.
And Sabin's confidence in his highly attenuated strains must have been just immense, because the sources mention his willingness to test the live virus on himself first.
And his family. And his immediate colleagues.
It's a staggering act of conviction for a disease that was still paralyzing people globally.
It really speaks to his deep professional integrity. You wouldn't ask the public to take a risk you weren't willing to take yourself.
And following those initial personal tests, the first formal clinical trials began in late 1954.
At the Chillicothe, Ohio Reformatory. Using a controlled population like that allowed him to rigorously prove the safety and effectiveness of the live virus strains before moving to general population testing.
But the U.S. regulatory environment was cautious.
Extremely cautious, especially after the Cutter incident.
Right, where a bad batch of Salk vaccine accidentally contained active virus and actually caused paralytic polio.
So the U.S. was slow-walking the live vaccine trials, which forced Sabin to look elsewhere. And this is where the Cold War collaboration comes in. It's truly one of the most stunning parts of this deep dive.
Yeah, this is critical context. The March of Dimes, which had poured millions of dollars into Salk's IPV.
They were staunchly opposed to the live vaccine, and the Public Health Service was hesitant.
Sabin needed millions of subjects to definitively prove safety on a large scale. And the politics of the mid-50s made this impossible in the U.S.
So he turns to the Soviet Union.
From 1956 to 1960, Sabin worked directly with Russian colleagues, most notably a scientist named Mikhail Chumakov, to perfect his strains and conduct mass trials.
This cooperation, crossing the intense political chasm of the Cold War, is just astounding.
How was he even able to pull this off?
The sources indicate that the Soviet scientists, particularly Chumakov, they were operating under intense pressure to solve the polio crisis in their own country, which was also having severe epidemics.
So they prioritized public health over ideology.
They did. Sabin essentially shared his most valuable intellectual property, the live virus seed strains, with the Soviet Union. Chumakov was then able to organize the first industrial production and mass deployment of the vaccine.
And we are not talking about a small trial here. The scale of this testing was colossal, and it was long before any U.S. licensing.
At least 100 million people were vaccinated across the USSR, Eastern Europe, Singapore, Mexico, the Netherlands.
Just think about the logistics and the historical risk involved. An American scientist provides a sensitive live viral product to the Soviets, and they administer it to 100 million of their citizens.
And that massive deployment created an overwhelming, globally recognized data set that proved the OPV's extraordinary effectiveness and safety.
This international pressure was the critical impetus needed to push the American medical establishment, which was stalling.
Right. Because while the U.S. Public Health Service was hesitant, they couldn't ignore the fact that the Soviets were successfully eliminating polio in their country and exporting the vaccine to places like Japan, which was suffering a severe epidemic.
The pressure became unbearable after the crucial U.S. trial in April 1960, conducted in Sabin's home base of Cincinnati.
Yes, 180,000 school children were immunized with the OPV. The results were immediate and conclusive.
Polio was effectively eradicated in the city.
Despite that success, the March of Dimes continued its opposition, favoring Salk's product.
It's hard not to view that as a kind of institutional loyalty overriding scientific necessity, especially when you're faced with the enormous global data Sabin had collected.
The sources strongly suggest institutional friction. The Public Health Service continued to stall licensing, even as other major global health bodies were endorsing the OPV.
But eventually the data prevailed, backed by sheer humanitarian necessity.
It did. Type 1 was licensed in 1961, followed by Types 2 and 3 in 1962.
And we can't move on without discussing the iconic method of administration. The oral vaccine, especially those early monovalent types, had a bitter, salty taste.
Right, so the practical solution they came up with is now part of pop culture history.
The sugar cube.
The sugar cube. The vaccine was dropped onto a sugar cube to make it palatable, particularly for children. And the simplicity of that oral administration, no needles required, was another huge advantage over the Salk injection for mass vaccination campaigns.
And here's a great piece of source trivia. This iconic delivery method is said to have directly inspired the lyricist Robert B. Sherman.
His son received the vaccine this way.
And it led to the famous song A Spoonful of Sugar Helps the Medicine Go Down for the 1964 film Mary Poppins.
It's a great example of a scientific advancement leaving this fun, indelible mark on popular culture.
By 1964, a single trivalent OPV containing all three serotypes was approved.
And it quickly became the predominant vaccination method in the U.S. for the next 3 decades. The critical takeaway here really is the mechanism. The OPV was the only tool that provided the mucosal immunity needed to stop person-to-person spread and achieve that global goal of eradication.
Sabin's triumph over polio is, of course, just part of the story. If the science gave him the victory, his ethical framework is what provided the legacy.
Yes. We have to return to his decision not to pursue profit from the vaccine.
It's a decision that must have cost him personally billions in potential revenue.
It's a staggering financial sacrifice. It reflects a rare purity of mission. By refusing to patent the vaccine, he guaranteed that pharmaceutical industries could produce it at the absolute lowest cost, maximizing global spread.
The sources emphasized this was a conscious, deliberate choice to prioritize human well-being over any personal financial gain.
It really stands in stark contrast to the modern era, where pharmaceutical profits are expected and often monumental.
Did this decision create any lasting friction with organizations or individuals who felt he was undercutting the commercial viability of medical innovation?
The sources don't really focus on friction, they focus on the positive outcome. That guaranteed low cost ensured that developing nations, where the need was greatest and the cost barrier was highest, could afford mass immunization campaigns.
And his legacy is carried forward today.
It is. By the Sabin Vaccine Institute, founded in 1993, which continues his mission in vaccine research and advocacy. They award the annual Albert B. Sabin Gold Medal to those who follow his example.
And while his name is synonymous with polio, the sources are quick to remind us that he was a prolific, wide-ranging virologist. He spent decades tackling multiple viral threats.
He was far from a one-hit wonder. His research portfolio shows remarkable intellectual breadth.
Beyond polio, he made significant strides in developing vaccines against other viral diseases.
Notably encephalitis, which he worked on during World War II, and also dengue fever.
And he dedicated substantial energy to investigating the possible links between viruses and some forms of cancer,
suggesting an interest in these deep, persistent questions regarding viral pathology long before those ideas became mainstream.
Now let's pivot to his later life, because the personal context here provides a deeply profound narrative twist.
It really does. In 1983, Sabin developed a severe, debilitating condition, calcification of the cervical spine.
And this caused paralysis and intense, constant pain.
It is a cruel, almost poetic irony. The man who saved millions from a paralyzing disease would be struck by paralysis and chronic pain himself late in life.
But the sources show that his reaction to this personal catastrophe was characteristic of his lifelong dedication to alleviating human suffering.
He didn't retreat into silence. He used the experience to reshape his final mission.
That's right. In a television interview after his diagnosis, Sabin revealed that this personal experience with intense chronic pain had led him to a decision.
He decided to spend the rest of his life working on pain alleviation. He pivoted completely, from disease prevention to the treatment of chronic suffering.
It demonstrates this continuous, unbroken thread of dedication to human relief,
regardless of whether the suffering was caused by an infection or by musculoskeletal degeneration.
Fortunately, the sources do note that he underwent successful surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1992 at the age of 86 to address the spinal calcification.
He died a year later in Washington, D.C. in 1993 from heart failure.
And his global impact was recognized through this stunning array of high-level international awards.
Domestically, he received the National Medal of Science in 1970 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1986.
But the international honors, they truly reflect the scale of his cross-border influence, especially considering the political landscape at the time.
For developing the trivalent oral vaccine, which was largely deployed by the Eastern Bloc first, the president of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR awarded him the Medal of the Order of Friendship Among Peoples in 1986.
To receive the highest honors from both the United States and the Soviet Union during the height of the Reagan-era Cold War.
It's almost unheard of for a civilian scientist. It confirms that the utility of his work just transcended political ideology.
His early election to the Polio Hall of Fame in 1958 really foreshadowed this global recognition.
It did.
Finally, we should note the tangible, permanent commemoration in Cincinnati, Ohio, the site of his most critical research and U.S. trials.
The Cincinnati Convention Center was named after him for a time, but more importantly, the street that runs between the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center.
It was renamed Albert Sabin Way.
His legacy is permanently woven into the institutional fabric of pediatric medicine right where he did the work. It's a fitting and humble tribute to a man who, despite his international roots and global reach, anchored his career in a children's hospital dedicated to public service.
We've taken a deep dive into the technical, the political, and the ethical dimensions of Albert Sabin's life. So, if you're the learner, what are the foundational nuggets of knowledge you should carry forward from this complex story?
Well, I think the takeaways are pretty clear and powerful.
I agree.
First and foremost, it's the scientific differentiator. Sabin's physiological insight that polio begins and replicates profusely as an intestinal infection. That was the key.
And that led directly to the OPV, which provided mucosal immunity, a localized defense that blocked transmission entirely.
And that mechanism is why eradication became possible. It's what fundamentally distinguished the OPV from Salk's IPV, which only protected the individual from paralysis.
Second, I'd say the sheer audacity and necessity of the international work.
Oh, yes. His collaboration with his Russian colleagues, which led to the mass immunization of 100 million people before the U.S. even licensed the vaccine.
It just highlights how science must, and in this case did, transcend political deadlock. That global data was the weapon he used to defeat institutional resistance at home.
And third, the powerful ethical example. His deliberate refusal to patent the vaccine, waiving all commercial exploitation to guarantee low cost and widespread use.
It's the ultimate statement on prioritizing public health over personal gain.
And that choice ensured that the OPV, which was the superior eradication tool, could actually reach the populations that needed it most, and rapidly.
And to connect those dots even further on his internationalism, the sources mention his trip to Cuba in 1967.
Right.
This wasn't a vacation. It was a diplomatic effort to discuss establishing a collaborative scientific relationship between the U.S. and Cuba through their national academies of sciences.
All despite the two countries lacking any formal diplomatic ties at the time.
That's a perfect illustration of the man in action. Sabin's goal was universal coverage.
His political approach was always pragmatic. If a government, regardless of its ideology, was willing to mass vaccinate its population for the sake of public health, he was willing to collaborate and provide the technology.
Free of charge.
His refusal to patent ensured the vaccine's low price, which, when you couple it with this persistent international outreach, guaranteed the rapid global immunization necessary to fight the virus everywhere.
So we end with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Sabin's towering legacy is defined by preventing disease, by achieving eradication, one of medicine's greatest achievements.
And yet, the sources give us this deeply human detail about his later life, developing calcification of the cervical spine, experiencing paralysis and intense pain.
And vowing to spend his remaining years focused on pain alleviation.
This late career pivot from the triumph of preventing disease globally to the intensely personal mission of treating human suffering, it raises an important question for future innovation.
While polio eradication is an unparalleled success, we have to consider.
In the future of medicine, what revolutionary breakthroughs will prioritize quality of life and pain management as much as they focus on large-scale disease eradication?
It serves as a reminder that the fight against human suffering takes many forms, and sometimes the deepest insights come from personal experience. A compelling thought to end on, reminding us that even the greatest pioneers never stop seeking solutions.
Indeed.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive into the life and world-changing work of Albert Bruce Sabin. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to The Debate.
Today, we're diving into one of the greatest public health victories of the 20th century, the life and work of Albert Sabin, the Polish-American researcher who gave the world the oral polio vaccine, or OPV.
His vaccine was absolutely fundamental in bringing us to the very edge of eradicating polio. The success is undeniable, but the real intellectual tension, I think, lies in pinpointing the core driver of that profound and incredibly rapid global achievement.
Right, that's the essential question. We had two effective polio vaccines, Salk's and Sabin's. But only one achieved that swift, widespread global reach needed to truly stop transmission. So what was it? Was it the intrinsic, superior biological mechanism of Sabin's live vaccine, or was the tipping point his strategic and I would say deeply ethical decision to waive all commercial rights and prioritize mass, nonprofit, international deployment?
I'm going to argue today that the primacy belongs squarely with the science. The eradication of polio was, in a way, scientifically mandated by the unique properties of the OPV. Sabin's genius was in fundamentally understanding how the polio virus actually worked in the human body.
And I'll be contending that while the OPV was, of course, the better tool for the job, its global trajectory was determined not by its chemical makeup, but by its deployment. A superior product is useless if it's stuck behind patents, profit motives, or, political red tape. Sabin's non-commercial stance was a lever that allowed this tool to achieve critical mass almost immediately.
Okay, so to start, we really have to appreciate Sabin's original insight, which was purely biological. Through extensive research, including autopsies of polio victims, Sabin confirmed that the polio virus first multiplied in the digestive tract, specifically the intestines, before it invaded the nervous system. Now, Salk's vaccine, which came out in 1955, was a monumental success in preventing the disease. It put antibodies into the bloodstream and it protected the central nervous system. But Salk's approach had a critical flaw, at least in the context of global eradication. It did not prevent the initial intestinal infection.
You're referring to viral shedding.
Exactly. The Salk vaccine prevented paralysis, which is fantastic for the individual, but it didn't block replication in the gut. So an immunized person could still harbor the virus, replicate it, and shed it through their feces, meaning they could still infect other people. The virus reservoir remained active. For true eradication, you need an agent that blocks transmission entirely. Sabin's OPV, being a live attenuated virus, worked directly in the intestines. It stimulates a mucosal immune response right there in the gut lining, which physically blocks the poliovirus from replicating and stops it from ever entering the bloodstream. This superior ability to break the chain of transmission is the indispensable scientific foundation for eradication. Everything else, the oral drops, the sugar cube, the trivalent vaccine, all of it flows directly from the live, attenuated, biologically superior nature of the vaccine.
Okay, I readily grant the scientific superiority of the mucosal immunity. It was definitely the better tool for breaking transmission, but the history is clear that the superior tool was politically and commercially marginalized in the West. What vaulted the OPV from being a theoretically superior vaccine into a global health phenomenon was the strategic removal of financial self-interest. Sabin refused to patent it, specifically waiving commercial exploitation. And he did this explicitly because he believed a low price would guarantee a more extensive spread of the treatment. This wasn't just a noble gesture, it was a radical strategy.
But was it the primary driver of success?
Absolutely, because it allowed for immediate, massive, international deployment, bypassing all the Western commercial requirements. I mean, just consider the scale. Between 1955 and 1961, the oral vaccine was tested on at least 100 million people. In the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Singapore, Mexico, this was an unprecedented clinical trial, led largely by the Soviet scientist Mikhail Shumakov. And that scale was only possible because there were no commercial barriers. This provided the critical impetus, the irrefutable mass evidence that finally forced the United States to pay attention and conduct its own trials, like the landmark 1960 Cincinnati tests. This strategy accelerated the science's adoption despite the march of dime's commitment to Salk and all the stalling by the U.S. Public Health Service.
Well, let's pull back to the core epidemiological necessity, because without it, the scale of distribution is frankly immaterial to the goal of eradication. You can vaccinate 1 billion people with Salk's vaccine, prevent paralysis in almost all of them, but you will never eradicate the virus. It will just keep circulating asymptomatically. The decisive factor that allowed for the possibility that polio might one day be eradicated was the OPV's unique biological capacity to stop viral shedding. The difference between disease control and eradication is the difference between Salk and Sabin, and that difference is entirely biological.
I understand the theoretical biological ceiling you're describing, but I challenge the notion that this theoretical capacity is what drove the speed and the success of its global adoption. The potential for eradication was only realized at the pace it was because of the logistical and geopolitical opportunities enabled by Sabin's choices. You mentioned the PHS stalling. Well, they stalled because commercial interest and institutional alignment, namely the March of Dimes, were heavily invested in Salk's vaccine. While that regulatory battle was going on in the US, the USSR was free to send millions of doses of the oral vaccine to places with polio epidemics, such as Japan, which accelerated elimination across the globe.
But that deployment, as massive as it was primarily about proving the safety of a novel biological mechanism, a live attenuated virus, not proving the strategy.
I see why you'd frame it that way, but doesn't that fundamentally overlook the massive logistical hurdle Sabin had already cleared? The non-commercial nature and the willingness to cooperate internationally, even with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, allowed the OPV to deploy where the need was highest, and critically, faster than the established systems in the West would have ever permitted. The strategy determined the pace of elimination. The biology only provided the theoretical endpoint.
That reliance on geopolitical maneuvering is certainly compelling, but let's consider the practical implication of waiving the patent. Was it truly this insurmountable economic barrier you describe? The crucial turning point in the U.S. wasn't some sudden profit-free distribution. It was the documented public evidence of a superior scientific effect. The ultimate licensing for all 3 OPV strains in the U.S. happened between 61 and 62, after the massive Cincinnati schoolchildren trials in 1960.
And why were those trials so pivotal?
Because they demonstrated in a highly public and measurable way that mass immunization with OPV effectively eradicated polio transmission in an entire city. This incontrovertible public health success provided the scientific mandate that just overwhelmed the commercial and political resistance. The Public Health Service was essentially forced to license the strains because of public and scientific pressure. If the OPV were only marginally better, that institutional pressure would have held. It was the quality of the science, the documented eradication, that compelled regulators. The superior biology was the underlying catalyst for acceptance.
We're sorry, but I just don't buy that the science alone could have overcome that institutional drag so quickly without the strategic validation from abroad. The March of Dimes was an institutional behemoth. It had invested millions in Salk. How do you break that kind of inertia? You break it by presenting undeniable massive-scale proof that the PHS could not ignore. The extraordinary effectiveness and safety of the OPV was proven on a population of 100 million people in those international trials before widespread use in the U.S.
That international validation was necessary, I agree, but it was necessary primarily because the vaccine utilized a fundamentally higher-risk technology, a live virus, that required unprecedented testing to prove its safety.
Precisely. And that scale of testing, which generated the data that forced the PHS's hand, was only possible because Sabin refused to seek commercial exploitation. This allowed for immediate, cheap mass production in places like the Soviet Union. Had Sabin insisted on conventional Western pathways, we might never have achieved the 100 million test subjects necessary to prove the live attenuated virus was safe enough to displace the already effective Salk vaccine. The scheme of deployment driven by the non-commercial strategy was the critical factor.
But let's consider the ethics of that. You celebrate the speed of the 100 million person trials, but for a live virus, one that carries a small but real risk of vaccine-associated polio, was that non-commercial strategy ethically sound without the traditional Western guardrails and phased clinical trials?
That's a powerful question. But in the context of a devastating global epidemic, speed saves lives. Sabin acted on a clear public health imperative. The vaccine was the most effective tool, and it needed to be deployed immediately. His strategy was a recognition that existing commercial mechanisms were too slow, and besides, he wasn't just handing out drops blindly. Soviet researchers like Chumakov were committed to documenting safety. Sabin himself had already tested the strains on himself, his family, and colleagues, and run trials at the Chillicothe, Ohio Reformatory in late 1954.
Right, I acknowledge those early trials precisely because they show he was committed to the scientific integrity and safety well before the big international deployments. The scientific premise was established. The international deployment was the logistical pathway needed to overcome institutional preference for the IPV. But the biological superiority was always the foundational strength.
And that is where our perspectives diverge. I agree the scientific potential was there, but the strategic choice unlocked that potential. Look at the fact-finding trip Sabin made to Cuba in 1967. During a period of intense diplomatic friction, Sabin was able to operate purely as a scientist and public health advocate. This ability to work across insurmountable political divides, facilitated only by the removal of commercial self-interest, is what defines the OPV's unique speed and success. The strategy was the engine that powered the biologically superior machine.
A compelling demonstration of personal integrity, no doubt. But even in Cuba, the eradication was successful because the biological agent, the OPV, could provide that widespread intestinal immunity. He designed the best tool for the job.
And I maintain that the best tool for the job sat on the shelf for years, in the U.S., caught in institutional loyalty. It took the strategic, non-commercial actions of Sabin, actions which generated massive, non-Western clinical data, to finally get that tool off the shelf and into the hands of the global public.
Look, it's impossible to deny the profound impact of Sabin's refusal to patent his work. It allowed for the cheap, wide distribution that was essential for reaching vulnerable populations.
And it's equally impossible to deny that without that strategic decision to partner with nations outside the Western framework, the OPV would have languished, giving the polio virus years of extra time. Sabin's personal commitment, his refusal to gain financially, his engagement with geopolitical adversaries, that was the critical accelerant.
Ultimately, Albert Sabin's legacy stems from a perfect, rare confluence of scientific genius and ethical leadership. His scientific insight into how the virus works provided the only functional solution for eradication.
And his ethical leadership, his strategic genius in waiving commercial rights, was the critical factor that overcame the inertia and obstacles. So you're left to weigh which of these two defining qualities provided the greatest momentum toward eliminating one of the world's most feared diseases. There's clearly much more to explore in how scientific innovation intersects with global policy.